It hurts my heart to see that young men are struggling more than ever. What demographic in the United States is most likely to commit and follow through on a suicide? 16 to 24-year-old men. Why is this the case? Why are young men seemingly more lost now than ever? Our cultural narrative around masculinity has completely gone off course. Now, on one hand, we get online and we see these folks that exist in the manosphere. We have Andrew Tate and Sneeko, these people that represent a very specific expression of masculinity, this conqueror's mentality. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, go out there and get it, and if you don't, you're a bitch. And now on the contrary, there are a lot of men that feel like there is a cultural and societal push of femininity, that men are being encouraged to be feminized and drift further away from their masculinity. Now, what I don't see is the understanding of how these two pieces go together for a man. These two masculine, feminine expressions of self, how they need to exist within man to fully actualize a man's true masculine nature. The point of this video is to teach you, my listeners, how to turn on and activate your inner healthy masculinity so that you can reclaim your fire, grab your sword, and get back in the arena of life. So what is masculinity? How do we define it? So I took a look at the etymology of the word, and masculinity comes from a Latin word of masculus, which means worthy of a male. And I think that's really interesting, that specific phrasing, worthy of a male. What makes one worthy of their own masculinity, of manhood? I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I have the answers, because I don't. But what I do have is some awareness of very specific mythology that helps us understand our masculine nature. I studied depth psychology, analytical psychology. What is very popular in analytical psychology is the analysis of mythology and looking at myth as symbol and looking at story arc as a psychological representation of development. And so there's a very specific myth that deals with this question of masculinity and how to activate it. This myth is the myth of the Fisher King. So there's a kingdom, and this kingdom is failing because our Fisher King is wounded. We have a kingdom that has no bounty, has no harvest, and our king is wounded in a very specific area. In fact, he is wounded in his generative function, in his genitalia. It's supposed to be representative of man's inability to access his masculine nature and actually generate for himself and his people his kingdom. And then we start with the young fool, Parsifal. Parsifal literally actually means in translation, poor fool, a young fool, a naive fool with a lot of courage who's ready to go on this journey. And so in looking at Parsifal, Parsifal is the beginning of this psychological development. Where he sits at the beginning of the story is where we sit at the beginning of this psychological journey as we interact with this myth. And as Parsifal goes through the story, eventually the resolution that he comes to with the king is the resolution of our psychological development. So I'm not going to get too deep into the Fisher King myth, but just these first couple pieces and these first couple stages are going to be extremely informative in understanding masculinity, how to activate it, and what the myth is really trying to tell us. So Parsifal approaches him and he notices that the king is wounded. He notices that the king is not well. And now in this moment, Parsifal feels an instinct to ask the king about his wound, his curiosity, his empathy. How did you get hurt? Tell me about your wound. What happened to you? But Parsifal in that moment, he suppresses this empathetic instinct and he leaves. And he goes on this whole hero's journey where he rescues fair maidens and slays dragons and goes on this whole entire quest until one day he comes back and he returns and he sees the king again existing on the river, just fishing. He's the Fisher King. And now at this point, because of Parsifal's journey that he's been on, because of everything that he's been through, everything that he's had to overcome, Parsifal knows suffering. He knows wounding in the same way that the Fisher King knows his wound. So at the end of the Fisher King story, Parsifal returns and he returns to the king. And this time when he feels the instinct to ask the Fisher King what happened to him, he does. He uses his empathy. He asks the Fisher King how he got his wound. And as a result of him asking the proper question, the Fisher King is restored. And in this restoration of the king, the kingdom is restored as well. a fully actualized king that is now able to access his own generative quality. Because again, the Fisher King's wound was in his generative function. He couldn't generate. And so as a result of Parsifal using his empathy and asking this question, the king, man's generative function gets turned back on. And what was it again that turned on this generative function, that turned on our king's masculinity? Empathy. I know this feels contradictory. How is it that empathy is in fact the thing that allows me to embody a true, healthy, masculine nature? I do know one thing. Empathy and masculinity are very closely related, and masculinity itself is generative. It generates for its people, for himself, for the community. It's about generating good for our people. This is true masculine nature, and it gets turned on through empathy. Because when you understand pain and when you understand suffering, you're able to recognize and see the pain and suffering in others. That inspires you to generate solution and good for those that are in pain, that are suffering. By the way, if you all don't know me, my name is Brian Meyerhofer. I am an associate marriage family therapist and a men's coach. I help men reclaim their fire, grab their sword, and get back in the arena of life. If you feel like this is a journey worthy of embracing, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I appreciate the support. As I was speaking on earlier, these two different sides that we see in the manosphere, the red pill, Andrew Tate, conqueror's mentality, we see this sort of hyper feminized male on the other side. And these two things actually aren't mutually exclusive. They don't have to be at odds with one another. Because as a man, when you're able to relate and access your own femininity, your own empathy, that is indeed the thing that allows you to turn on your masculinity and allow you to reclaim your inner fire. And from that fire, you grab your sword and you get back in the arena of life because you're desperate to generate good for the community. The Fisher King myth tells us that our kingdom is not whole, that we are not whole, that there is no harvest and bounty for our people until empathy is present. So just to give a little brief rundown, I just want to go over some of the themes that were present today. And we can see that when a man lacks empathy, he lacks his healthy masculine. He lacks the masculine fire. He lacks the ability to grab his sword and bring order and restoration to his kingdom because empathy isn't present. How do you turn on your own empathy? It's through your own suffering. It's through understanding your own suffering and pain in your experience and witnessing it in others that allows you to catch hold of this inspirational masculine fire and want to generate solution and good for your kingdom, for your community, for your people. My guess is if you are watching this video right now, you probably have some experience with self-help, self-improvement. I made a video about the 5 traps that exist within the self-help space. You can go ahead and click the link. I'll post the box up here. You go ahead and check that out as well. I really appreciate you supporting the channel and looking forward to y'all tuning in on the next one.